Good morning. Welcome to this edition of the Richard Urban Show, where we present news and views from God's point of view. We're happy to have Mike Folk on. He's a Republican candidate for governor of West Virginia. So please introduce yourself.
Hello, I'm Mike Folk. I grew up in Berkeley County on a farm in Swan Pond. I went to local schools, local college actually too, Shepherd University. Studied education and economics. Ended up finishing my degree in economics. Worked for a year in the financial industry. Had all my Series 763, all your different financial licenses. And then I went to graduate school at WVU. Went into teaching a little bit, both at the high school and college level, while also flying and working for my dad's aviation business, my dad had a heart attack between my junior and senior year, so I was the guy involved in hiring a pilot to take his place it's a seasonal business. And then I left Shepherd University Shepherd College at the time, and went to work in Mack Trucks in Hagerstown for a year, their engine plant. And I really just didn't really like being inside all day, and fell in love with flying. So I went in pursuit of an airline career, became an airline pilot, and I got married just a little bit before I was my 30th birthday to my wife, Stella, and we now have 5 children. My wife was a school teacher for, 14 years, something like that, 12, 14 years. And so you haven't heard any politics in there yet. I finally, in the 08 to 012 time frame, I started getting a little frustrated with some things that were going on at the national level. We know who was the head of it all at that time, some guy named Obama. And so in 2012, I ran for office, the House of Delegates, and served 6 years in the House of Delegates, 2 years in the minority, 4 years in the majority. We got some good things done, but I think there's a lot left to be done. Particularly when we have a governor who, it doesn't matter what you do. If you're running against an incumbent, you gotta tell the differences. And so he was elected as a Democrat, switched to Republican, but really, in my opinion, hasn't really changed his principles much. So that's why I decided to run to try to give West Virginians what I believe is Phyllis Schlafly, if you ever heard of her, wrote a book. Yes. She was a Goldwater girl. She wrote a book to give the people a choice, not an echo, which I believe that the other major opponents are really just an echo of the past. And even though they've changed their stripes, for the lack of a better way of putting it, there's still the same failed policies that have led West Virginia to some pretty bad places.
Okay.
So that's who I am.
Hey, thank you. So what would you say, like, the 3 main things you would emphasize, like, in helping West Virginia, as you're running for governor?
Well, obviously the paradigm has shifted a little bit, even in the last 3 months with budget issues. And this is where I'm in 2017, when we had the last major budget problem, when Justice first took office, they were looking under his budget proposal, we were looking at a $450 million deficit. In reality, that was only about a $100 million deficit. The reason it was $450 million in his budget is because he raised government spending by $350 million, and a lot of cronyistic type plans that were going to benefit him and his cronies. And so in that case, I'm well suited to balance the budget without raising taxes, because at the time, when the governor was claiming that West Virginia he was using the analogy that West Virginia was kind of like a patient on life support, and the only way to save the patient was to raise taxes. And he kept saying that over and over. So a group of us got together, and I was the lead sponsor. My wife actually made up a nice spreadsheet for the budget to prove that we could have that we could balance the budget without raising taxes, and at that time still give the teachers a 2% pay raise. So I believe that. Reiterate that question.
Yeah, just asking, like, your 3 main points.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
That you're emphasizing.
I've done so many interviews. So one thing that's going to be critical is the budget. The next thing is going to be education. There's a lot of serious issues in education. A lot of them have resulted from Common Core and getting away from and some people say this is cliche, but getting away from the basics. We've done too much social engineering, let's put it that way, in education, and gotten away from learning the basics and leaving the social stuff to the home, the family, and the church. So that's education. I think is a important part in West Virginia. The biggest part about education is very top heavy, very Charleston centric. We call it Building 6 down there.
Right.
And then, the third thing is really, and this is really come to the forefront during this whole pandemic, is Constitution. We shouldn't be suspending the Constitution. This is important in West Virginia because if you just, or in anywhere in the country, but we basically thrown the Constitution, and in particular the state Constitution, under Article 3, Section 10, which the title of is Safeguards for Life, Liberty, and Property. And then the exact wording in that article says no person shall be denied, or no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law and the judgment of their peers. And we've had thousands of small businesses that have been shut down around the state in a very illogical and unconstitutional way.
Right.
The person that has the small shop that sells clothing store and shoe store, for instance, was shut down. But yet the huge Walmarts where you can still buy clothing and shoes was allowed to stay open. And so you had these mass amount of people going to the Walmarts, to the Lowe's, to the other stores. So if the intent was to prevent people from congregating, shutting down small businesses was the exact opposite of what should have been done. So, and
Right.
in reality, it was literally a power grab by the governor. And this whole thing, especially after the first couple of weeks of realizing that this wasn't as bad as they thought it was going to be. And you've probably you've heard about the model out of England that said, projected 2.2 million deaths in the U.S. And we're nowhere close to that. And I don't think we ever. And in fact, the whole idea in West Virginia, the whole concept behind shutting these things down was to flatten the curve.
Right.
So we didn't overwhelm the hospitals. Well, literally 6 weeks ago now, the two major talking heads for the hospitals, which is Clay Marsh, the head of WVU Medicine, Medical School, and Albert Wright, the CEO of WVU Medicine, both said on a statewide talk line by Hoppy Kirchville that the hospitals could handle any surge. So why is it taking 6 weeks to open our economy? And now we've opened it for the most part, but there's still some things closed. And even the places that we've opened, we've put severe restrictions on some of their businesses. So
Right.
I think we've the cure, and I think it was the president said we can't have the cure worse than the illness. Well, that's exactly what we've done in West Virginia and many other states around the country. Not all. I mean, Governor Kristi Noem out of South Dakota never shut her. So I think we should have done more like South Dakota or like Sweden.
I agree with that. Yeah. And also out there, it seems like their statistics aren't worse, really. They're doing okay, and they haven't committed harikari on the businesses or whatever. I was listening to some people were saying that 25% of restaurants will never reopen. They're like out of business, for one example,
Well, yeah, there's a lot of, there was a survey done, and I can't remember the numbers behind it, but there was a huge amount of and this was a national survey of small businesses, I think by the National Federation of Business, NFB, I believe. And they're literally thousands, and 10 or 20% of the businesses, I said they would never open again. And we've never, the pandemic, they've said it was unprecedented. Well, that's hogwash. Pandemics, let me rephrase that. They said it was unprecedented in our lifetime, is what they said. When in reality, if you looked at what happened, we had two major flu pandemics in the 20th century, besides the one that most everybody, 99.9% of the people were not around in 1917 and 18.
Right.
But the one in 57, 58, and then the one in 68, 69 were huge flu pandemics. And in fact, the one in 68, 69, the peak of the infection was after Woodstock. And I think in that pandemic, over 100,000 people in the U.S. died, and we had a third less population. And they've equated that if that were relative to the population we have now, we'd be looking at 200 to 250,000 deaths. So to say it's unprecedented is first of all not logical.
Yeah.
But more importantly, what I will agree that is unprecedented is the reaction of our various state governments, specifically our governors, has been unprecedented.
Yeah. I agree with you on that. So do you think, like here in West Virginia, there should be a legislative review? I noticed in some states the legislature was more active. I know we have a part-time legislature in like challenging, like in Wisconsin, they got the things overturned in court, the mandates. So what I'm asking in short is, should the legislature look at like the health authorities? Like I noticed in our Constitution, I looked a little bit in the West Virginia Constitution, it seems like these so-called authority of the health department is very broad, and maybe it needs to be reined in, or what do you think?
Well, in the code, which I believe is under Chapter 16, the health officers in the various counties have an incredible amount of power. But a code section does not preclude the Constitution. I mean, it doesn't supersede the Constitution of West Virginia.
Right.
So if you're going to go out and shut down businesses, you have to follow due process. I mean, I just said you can't. Article 310 is very clear. And I haven't looked at all the case law behind that, but what has taken place in West Virginia and really in these various states is unprecedented. And I do believe that the legislature will be taking a hard look next session, no matter who is elected. Now, whether they do anything serious about it or not, but they'll be taking a hard look at Chapter 15, which is the emergency authorities of the governor, and Chapter 16, which is the health officers' authorities. I mean, like I think it was in Wisconsin specifically where the judge, the court ruled against them, that in their code, the emergency authority of the governor is limited to 30 days without the legislature taking action. See, in West Virginia, there is no limit on states of emergency on the time frame. So I'm sure there's going to be some type of limit offered by the legislature next session.
Yeah, and also I've noticed that, or we know that when Governor Justice put in these mandates, unlike other states, they said like it was 15 days or 30 days. There is no end. It's just like, I give this mandate and there's no date. I thought that was very strange. The lockdown.
Well, his original, before he shut down the businesses, his original executive order was very vanilla and benign. It really wasn't enforceable. It was called guidelines, as an example. I mean,
right.
He kept using the word guidelines, and it really didn't shut anything down. But then what it was a week or two later when he actually did shut stuff down, even though he called a lot of the stuff guidelines, the businesses were actually shut down, and the various agencies through the local county health departments had the enforcement mechanism. And like in Berkeley County, for instance, when they shut the barbers and stuff down and beauty shops, there was one barber who had applied for all these federal bailout dollars that were supposedly available for self-employed sole proprietorships. But this gentleman over in the South Berkeley County area was 71 or 72, and I'm not sure exactly why he wasn't eligible. It might be because he was already on Social Security, but he had a barber shop. It was a sole proprietorship. He was the only barber in the shop. He literally would only have one or two people in the shop per day. And since he wasn't eligible for those funds from those federal programs, the bailout money, he just said, I have to make a living. So he opened his shop up, and they went and arrested him.
Where was that?
That was in southern Berkeley County, just one county over from you.
Okay. Wow. Yeah, I do think that's excessive. Well, I agree with you on that. I'm glad you brought that out. Yeah, this is these unconstitutional orders of the governors, but Governor Justice specifically. I think it is like way overreach. Like you say, the
Well,
here is much worse.
I have not seen a challenge yet of his orders, and from a constitutional perspective. Now, I don't know. I know if I was if I was a business owner that was affected by these orders, I'd be talking to my friends in that business community, and I think there may be a serious basis for a challenge to force these guys because uh, they took the use of their property, even if only for a temporary basis, 2 or 3 months, without compensation. That's unprecedented in West Virginia history.
Yeah, I agree. Well, to change the topic a little, something that's dear to my heart is the issue of also talking about constitutional freedoms. Our policy on forced vaccination, or you might say, like, if you don't get every vaccine that's mandated in West Virginia, you can't, send your child to public school. Would you like? How do you feel about that? Is that a good policy? Is that a bad policy?
Well, I think you know my history on that. I was the lead sponsor to get rid of mandatory vaccinations. Look, if vaccinations are done properly, and in the sense, when I say done properly, I'm talking about developed, brought to market. But we know since the 1986 federal law that exempted all vaccine manufacturers from any liability, there have been a multitude. I mean, I could tell you and I are a little older.
Right.
So when we were growing up, there might have been, a handful of vaccinations that you would get, maybe 3 or 4, smallpox, polio. I think that's probably all I ever got that I can recall right off the top of my head. I might have missed one, but I mean, we didn't get a chickenpox vaccination, and if we got a measles vaccination, it wasn't a combination of 3 vaccines. It wasn't the
Right.
MMR. So I think I believe in informed consent and letting people make their decisions. Uh, the reality is that, especially, it's an interesting conversation right now because they're talking about mandatory mandating, having the governors mandate this potential vaccine that's coming out for this
Yeah, that's right.
COVID-19, which is actually SARS-CoV-2. So it's the
Right.
second SARS virus. The first one was the 2003 SARS virus. And if you look very logically and scientifically at what happened with the first SARS, when they tried to develop a vaccine, and this is well documented by the talking heads in this very discussion, the Fauci's of the world. He actually testified in front of the U.S. Senate that that he said 2 things. It's not a guarantee that we're going to get an effective vaccine for this virus. And number 2, and more importantly, he said it could actually have, and I'll use his word, quote, suboptimal results. And there are several other immunologists that are familiar with that. And I talked to one doctor, I'm not going to mention his name, but he's a professor at a major university in West Virginia, and you probably know him. And he has friends that work in that field of vaccine development, vaccinologists, I think they call them. And he said specifically that his friends had told him that the first SARS, that when they tried to develop a vaccine for it, it actually backfired, and the vaccine was more dangerous than actually acquiring
Like, so
the
the
virus.
people, yeah, if they were exposed to the virus, then they would have an excessive reaction or something like
Yeah,
that too.
yeah, and that was also, that's been confirmed. When I say confirmed, it wasn't just Fauci that said it. I listened to a immunologist, somebody who's developed, the lady from Ireland who has developed a vaccine. She was in vaccine development. I think it was for what was that, Stella? Was that she has a vaccine on the market that she's developed. So she wasn't she's not an anti-vaxxer, but she said that she confirmed the same thing that Fauci had said. And so I've now heard it from 3 different uh, people, 2 directly and 1 indirectly through the doctor that I know at a major university in West Virginia. So putting all of it, and this is the conundrum, or The problem I see with some of our government policy right now, and these talking heads are on the various media sources, and including our current governor, he's basically saying we have to watch what we do until we get a vaccine. You know, I'm talking about economically and
Right,
socially.
right. That's
We
very
have to bridge ourselves to this vaccine when all of the professionals in that field are basically saying there's no guarantee we will have a vaccine because this is a SARS virus. Um, and the reality is, and we know this now, even the CDC is saying it. You know, the first person that I heard talk about this, you know, we always knew we had a multiple, to quote Fauci from a New England Journal of Medicine article. He said there was we know that the mortality rate is lower than the death rate, much because a lot of people, and he never put a number on it, but he said that there's a multiple of people that have been infected, showed very no symptoms or mild symptoms. The first person to actually put a number on it was the former head of the NFID, the National Foundation of Infectious Diseases. He now teaches at Vanderbilt University. I can't remember his name, William something, Dr. William something. And he put a number at 70%. That 70% of the people that get infected with the virus have no symptoms or mild symptoms.
right.
And then a local health doctor that speaks for Berkeley County and Berkeley and Morgan County, I think Dr. Reedy put a number on it. And I'm not sure where these guys got their numbers, but I'm just quoting their numbers. He said he believes 80% of the people get it, don't know, you know, they have mild symptoms or no symptoms. I think the CDC has put a number at 65%. No
I
matter
don't
how
know.
you cut it, over half the people don't have symptoms. And the CDC's own numbers now have the mortality rate at around 0.26% is their best guess estimate.
Yeah. Well, on that vein, before we may move to another topic, is like I noticed Dr. Marsh, you were mentioning him, you know, here in West Virginia, who's advising Governor Justice, saying that people should wear masks. And then what I'm reading saying they do little, if anything. Do you have any opinion about that? I mean, what are these guys trying to do? They don't seem very confident, for sure.
Well, the one thing that the mask discussion has brought to the forefront, even inside the scientific community, is there clearly is no consensus unless you happen to be getting your paycheck from a government entity. In other words, Marsh, all the talking heads at the national level, all the talking heads at the local level, the professional, so-called professional doctors and health department people, because some of them aren't doctors. Some of them just have like a master's in public health, which is not any kind of scientific degree by any stretch of the imagination. They all say the government paid doctors and medical authorities and health department officials all say masks work. In the private doctor and scientific community, they say they don't, or sometimes can be counterproductive depending on if you have other underlying health conditions for sure, like COPD.
Exactly.
Yeah, you're breaking up a little bit for some reason.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, I don't wear a mask in public. It's crazy. The craziest thing I've seen is when people are driving down the road and they have a mask on, or they're out in the sunshine out by themselves and they have a mask on. That makes no sense.
Okay. All right. So one thing I've been also interviewing some of the candidates. Thanks for sharing that on for the Commission of Agriculture. Like, would you support? And they're telling me, you know, about some of the very over the top, not over the top, cumbersome regulations. I know you're a farmer. Do you have any comment about that, or maybe what could be done to improve the situation for smaller farmers?
Well, when I was growing up in Berkeley County, Jefferson County, as an example, literally had 6 or 7 butcher shops where you could market your cattle, your hogs. And now we've consolidated the industry so much, and it's usually because of the burdensome regulation, because a small mom and pop that might employ 2 or 3 people can't keep up with those regulations that these massive processing facilities can. And I think having a just diverse food supply at the local level and less nationally would benefit all of society greatly. The problem with the current paradigm is that if you have an outbreak, like they did, like for instance, I mentioned Christy Nome, that one meat processing plant up there, and that's really where most of their cases came from, is actually owned by the Chinese government.
Wow.
And I'm trying to remember the name of it now, but that processing plant processed 20% of our U.S. pork production. And what I was told, and I've not confirmed this, but I was told that the reason there was an outbreak there is literally the management from China came into that plant about 2 or 3 weeks before the outbreak. And so literally somebody brought it into the plant from China. I haven't confirmed that. That's just kind of the rumor mill.
Okay.
But yeah, I believe that the best people to take care and keep this food supply safe are the producers closest to the markets. Is a local producer in Jefferson County going to take a chance and sell bad product and do things that are unsanitary? The answer is no. Because if a small business owner, family-owned business, has a problem with their product, they don't have lawyers on staff like these major companies do to defend themselves against an E. coli or any kind of other problem with their product. And I think the best producers are the ones closest to the consumers.
Okay. All right. Well, one other thing was close to my heart. Like when we're looking at the long-term kind of ideas of helping society, like helping with the whole family breakdown or opioid situation, and this is not maybe so much as a political, but more like a philosophical question. Like I've always thought, and our organization deals with emphasizing that youth should stay absent before marriage, that's the best standard for school-age children. Would you agree with that kind of approach? And that will help stabilize families and make them more successful. What, do you
Well,
have any thoughts on that?
anything we can do to help the what's the word I want to use, nuclear family stay together will take care of a lot of these ancillary issues. Single family house or single parent households are and the numbers. I can't remember her name, but the Black community, as an example, Candace Owens, I believe, in front of
Yeah.
Congress testified, and that's the number one issue in that community that destroys families is the number of single parent households. So I think all of those things together will produce the outcomes that we had a generation ago
Okay.
or 2 generations ago.
All right. Well, comparing yourself, to your like opponents, what would make you like, why should the voters choose you? What's most outstanding, or in comparison?
Well, I'm definitely more like the average voter than these 2 guys are. Both these guys are pretty wealthy guys compared to me. I mean, Justice inherited hundreds of millions of dollars, and in fact, even Woody 20 years ago or so inherited about $1 million. So I'm more like the average everyday citizen with a family, trying to raise a family, trying to make ends meet. But at the same time, I have experience in the legislatures, particularly from the budget perspective and the constitutional perspective on whether it's defending your Second Amendment, your First Amendment, the pro-life issues. I've got 100% pro-life and 100% pro-Second Amendment voting record. I've actually developed my own state budget. I don't think either one of those guys has. Now, Justice has signed a few. Of course, the first one that I proposed, which became a blueprint for what ultimately became law, that was if you recall, that's when Justice vetoed the budget on the silver platter with the cow pie. That year, Justice never signed a budget. It became law without his signature. A lot of you probably weren't even aware of that yourself.
No, I didn't know that.
Yeah, he vetoed the one on the silver platter with the cow pad, and then we went back in special session in June of 2017. We gave him a budget, but he wouldn't sign it. He let it become law because after a certain period of time, it becomes law automatically, and that's how that budget became law. So I think I have a better ear to the ground of the everyday uh, citizen in West Virginia, and I'll take that to the office if elected.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Yeah, any other closing thoughts or
Well, just get on my Facebook. If you're on social media, Michael Folk for West Virginia Governor. And my website is folk, the number 4, wv.com. And check me out if you haven't.
Okay, absolutely. Okay, we'll get this interview up on a video and podcast. I want to thank you very much for joining us today, and everyone be sure to vote on June 9th. Have a lot of important positions, of course, the governors and the Supreme Court justices. Okay, thank you very much. I am your host, Richard Urban. Thank you for joining us this morning, and do be blessed, and we will see you next time.